And thanks for having us. My name is Norman Bier. Like most of you in higher education, I wear a few hats. And so I'm the director of the Open Learning Initiative we talked most about today. I'm also the executive director of something called the Simon Initiative. I don't know how many of you are on East Coast time, but I am looking at the clock and definitely feeling a little tired. So if I start droning off at the end, apologies. I tried to hit some espresso and we'll try to give you a reasonable show. I'm joined by my colleague, Hal Turn. Hal leads our support and educator success team here at CMU. He really is one of the front faces of our organization and is really able to help out in answering questions down into the weeds. So hopefully between the two of us, we can tell you a little bit about OLI and our courseware. Quick question, show of hands if possible. How many of you have heard about the Open Learning Initiative? Mind? Trying to make this a little interactive. Got one hand, good. So for those of you that aren't aware, OLI sits at Carnegie Mellon University. We are a part of not-for-profit post-secondary education. And we are now moving into our 22nd year in working in this space, a few months off from that birthday. And in many ways, I think the research that has happened at OLI has helped to define what we now think of as the courseware space. And so I'm going to try to give you a quick tour, talking a little bit about OLI, what our history is, and how this relates to a lot of the other work that's happening at Carnegie Mellon. But, whoops. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to share my screen. Better. So this might be a little bit of a meandering path. So just to orient you, the Open Learning Initiative is focused on building open courseware that reflects the best of what we know from the learning sciences, integrating that work both from a technological perspective and from a pedagogical perspective in how we operate in the classroom. OLI's goal is to provide some of the best learning experiences possible, but to do so in ways that can facilitate ongoing learning research. So we want to improve outcomes for students, but we also want to advance the state of the art that's happening out in the world. Really key aspects to what we're talking about. And in some ways, at its simplest level, OLI is offering ready-to-adopt courseware. These are full textbook replacements that combine text and exposition, formative and summative assessments, interactive activities. They're often targeted at the domain of study. So a lot of the work that we now think of as traditional inside of courseware. As an organization, we're providing support for broader approaches to design, development, improvement, and customization of that courseware, both through tools and through direct hands-on support to educators. We are attempting to facilitate and advance learning research. We engage in it directly, partner with others. And we see OLI not simply as an organization, but as really a much broader post-secondary community of educators and researchers. And so though much of this work has a center of gravity at Carnegie Mellon, OLI does not live at Carnegie Mellon. OLI is really a broader community that exists primarily in the US, but increasingly around the world. I mentioned that I am the executive director of the Simon Initiative. And one of the best parts of my job is getting to talk about Herb Simon, who is as close as we have to a patron saint at Carnegie Mellon University. For any of you that haven't heard of Simon, he is a Nobel Prize winner in economics. He's also a Turing Award winner, Nobel Prize the Nobel Prize of Computer Science. And he would be horrified to hear himself described as a saint of anything, but the best way that I can describe the revere that Simon is held at the university is that there is only one building on CMU's campus that is not named for either a donor or a former president, and that is Newell Simon Hall. Simon's work started in investigating organizational behaviors, but in trying to understand how organizations behaved, he felt like he needed to try to understand how human beings behaved. And this in turn led him to really try to better understand how human beings think. This work sent him down a different path into exploring artificial intelligence, which led him back to understanding natural intelligence, human cognition. And Throughout his career, he was particularly interested in and concerned with this question of how we can go about improving post-secondary education. From his own perspective, we needed to really move away from thinking about teaching as a solo sport, one person sitting at the front of a room, or sitting here in front of you on a Zoom, talking at you, and instead start to think about this work of improvement as a community-based research activity. And when we talk about that as a research activity, that strikes a chord in post-secondary, right? Because what we're talking about in this sense is saying, look, we need to teach and treat that improvement as work that is as authentic and as important as the research that we engage in our own domains. So this is really the work of the Simon Initiative. Carnegie Mellon does not have a College of Education, but we have a tremendous body of work that sits at that intersection of technology, learning science, cognitive science, and psychology. And an awful lot of this is rooted back in work that Heard Simon launched over 50 years ago. When we think about what is key to this approach, key to this Simon Initiative or Carnegie Mellon work, we go back to a very specific Simon-esque notion, very cognitive science notion. And that is that if we are interested in studying and researching learning, then we must make learning something that is observable. And this is a challenge, right? Because learning is something that's happening inside of the brain. It's a change of knowledge state. It's not able to be directly observed. And so we're stuck making models of what we think is happening inside of the brain. And we then need to actually connect those models to observable practice. Right? We can then observe our practice, refine our model, and come closer to understanding what's happening. We talk about this approach at CMU as a learning engineering approach. It's really core to everything that we do at CMU and within the Open Learning Initiative. It's this idea that we can take what we know from the learning sciences, use it to create both models and to design new kinds of educational interventions. Key to these new interventions is the idea of instrumentation, right? We're going to be actually capturing data and observing these kinds of innovations, whether they're happening online or in the classroom, using these to refine that practice, and in the aggregate, pushing this work back into the learning sciences. So Simon Initiative emphasizes learning engineering, and the Open Learning Initiative, lots of initiative happening at CMU, is really an exemplar of this learning engineering approach. As I mentioned, I'm really lucky to be leading OLI as we move into this next decade. But when we think about OLI, we think about courseware, I think it's worth thinking a little bit about the history of how we got here. And so to do that, I want to look back at one of the seminal moments in the open education movement, and that was the Hewlett Foundation's investment in MIT's Open Courseware project. Think back to 2000, those heady days of the dot-com boom, and continuing heady days of excitement at announcing transformational initiatives in the New York Times. The Hewlett Foundation was looking around at the opportunities that were provided by the World Wide Web and thought that there was some way to leverage these new technologies to emphasize better access to new kinds of materials. And so at this point, Kathy Casserly and Mike Smith made an investment in MIT that was intended to take any materials that MIT faculty were willing to share, lecture notes, slides, videos, assessments, put them online with this goal that it was going to transform learning. One of the quotes that you saw, I believe, from Tom Friedman, although I'd like to beat up on Tom Friedman, so I could be misremembering, is that this was going to give every child in Africa access to an MIT level education. So lots of excitement there. And in the face of this excitement, the program officers from the foundation came to visit us at Carnegie Mellon and said, hey, do you see all this exciting stuff that's happening at MIT? Yeah, we see what's happening at MIT. A little bit of a rivalry between MIT and CMU. They said, well, would you like to do the same thing? Would Carnegie Mellon like to put its lecture notes and slides online? And we said, no, that doesn't seem very interesting to us. I said, okay, that's strange, but that's fine. And they left. Strange coincidence of history is that Mike and Kathy happened to be visiting us on September 10th in 2001. And when they headed to the airport the next day to leave, get back to the West Coast, there were no planes flying anywhere. They apparently debated driving back to California, but instead came back to campus and were stuck with us for the next 4 days. And this gave us a really remarkable chance to sit down and talk deeply with program officers who could ask, okay, if that's not interesting to you, what is interesting? And our answer is, look, we believe in your access agenda, but we think that equally important is an effectiveness agenda, that simply putting materials out there without any sense of how they're able to enact learning isn't interesting and isn't as valuable as it could be. And so what we proposed was really leveraging Carnegie Mellon's strengths in technology, in how human beings use technology, but also in learning science and how human beings learn, to see if we could use this tech to build online evidence-based courses that could demonstrably enact instruction for independent learners. And so we said, yeah, that does sound interesting. This was the initial investment in OLI. Can we build materials that can support independent learners, student out there in the world that just wants to learn statistics? What we found pretty quickly was that, yes, in fact, if you make this kind of careful design-based approach in building these experiences and technologies, you can demonstrably enact learning for independent learners. But when you put these materials in the hands of experienced, passionate educators, we find that they're able to do more in the classroom, and they're able to help their students to succeed in different ways. And so over time, OLI's mission has evolved to look not just at building online courseware for students, but also to think about and engage with educators on how this work is built and designed. When we talk about OLI, then we're talking not just about the courseware, but also about this larger approach to designing, developing, delivering these learning experiences, and thinking about how we can go about improving them. So OLI is building courseware. We're doing a number of other things, and we've got some really specific ideas and philosophies behind how we build that courseware. You've heard from a number of courseware providers, it sounds like, not just today, but over the past weeks and months. So I'm going to highlight what is it that's distinctive about the work that OLI does. I think, sort of straight off the top, hopefully something that you've heard about has been this scientific approach. Some of this being that OLI is embedding what we know from the learning sciences and how our materials are designed. But a different way to think about a scientific approach is that we treat learning design as hypothesis, that with every learning activity that we are creating, with every experience, we are creating an explicit hypothesis that a student engaging with these materials will be able to learn, experience a change of knowledge state. And we are explicitly committing ourselves to building these experiences in a way that we can see whether that hypothesis, we've proven out that hypothesis, right? So this assumes that we are creating active learn by doing opportunities, whether this is in traditional activities or new custom domain specific components that are going to allow us to assess not just student learning, but then in the aggregate, how successful this hypothesis has been, and to then return and test it. What you also heard embedded in that description is this idea that we are emphasizing and embedding in our platform principles derived from learning science. I can go on this topic for at least an hour and a half. So let me just say that I think the most important piece of this, and the thing that you see throughout OLI, is this notion that goal-directed practice, targeted feedback are just absolutely critical to learning. And so we need to give students support in the problem-solving context with immediate feedback that targets their misconceptions, with hints that give them immediate help. Another thing that distinguishes OLI is an almost obsessive focus on data. Everyone talks about capturing clickstream data. Ours is a focus on capturing learner interaction data. Some of this we're able to use to provide feedback to students on their performance, most often in the form of immediate feedback as they're solving problems. But we're also able to use these data to help instructors think about and change what they do in the classroom. An example on the screen of a tool that we call the Learning Dashboard. Within every OLI course, all of our assessments are targeted and connected back to learning objectives and sub-skills. Sitting behind these is a model estimating how much practice students are going to need and what kinds of success they're demonstrating that allow us to show the faculty member for the class as a whole, where we estimate their students have a high degree of mastery, where we see students that are still struggling, and where we see students that need a lot of help. Practically, this means that you can assign a module in OLI, it's a module from one of our statistics courses, before class, and then give a quick look to see, okay, for the first two objectives, most of the students really seem to be succeeding, but we see a lot of struggle in these bottom two objectives. Let me drill down to see what are the skills that students seem to be struggling with, what are the questions that they're getting wrong, and then really start to drill in at a finer grain to see what are the misconceptions that they're demonstrating, and how can I change my instructional practice to really try to address and drill into those misconceptions. Or when the course is really working perfectly, everything on the board is green, and you can use this to really dive into some of the harder, thornier problems of the discipline that are one of the reasons that we've got experts in the classroom. I just said that in a very fast, hopefully slick way that makes it sound easy, right? I'm just going to look at the dashboard and I'm going to adjust what I do in the classroom. Practically though, I teach computer science in the summer using OLI, and I am forced to eat my own dog food frequently. And of course, it's not as simple as just eyeballing what happens on the dashboard and creating new classroom activities. And so one of the active areas of research for us, and one of the most important parts of collaboration that we have with this larger OLI faculty community, is really deeply understanding how at a broad level do we use these kinds of assets to adjust our instructional practice? What are the kinds of resources that we need to create, either centrally or as a larger community, that can support that kind of effective use and drive student success? That was a focus on students and on educators, but we're also able to use these data and push them back both into course improvement and into the larger science of learning. Lots of tools that are embedded in OLI's authoring and improvement environment, design audits that can help us understand even before courseware goes out to students, where it can be improved. Some new and emerging tools that really emphasize auditing accessibility and pedagogical audits, and an experimental tool that is hopefully on the verge of being released, that is going to help us to better understand how we can build more equitable and inclusive courseware, part of an ongoing grant with the Gates Foundation. Beyond the tools that are embedded in OLI, we also have some deep connections back into our learning science community, and we've got some access to some pretty high-powered tools that are integrated from CMU's educational data mining suite. The one that you're looking at in front of you is something called learning curve analysis. The idea being that for a given skill, when we learn, the first time that we're exposed to that skill or given a chance to practice it, we're going to need a lot of help. Right? It's going to be incorrect answers. I need to give different kinds of feedback and hints. And so we expect a very high assistance score. In a well-designed learning experience, with every opportunity that I have to practice a skill, I should need less help. And across a class or a cohort of students who are all taking advantage of the same materials, we should see that assistance score go down. And so what you're looking at on the screen is a perfect learning experience, right? Students show up, they're making mistakes, but the more practice they get with these problems, the less help they need. Ideally, every learning experience that we design would look like this, but practically, most learning experiences start off much more chaotically. And while this isn't ideal for that first cohort of learners, practically, this is going to be the case for any kind of learning experience that anyone delivers for the first time. The difference here is that we have both the data and the commitment to iterative improvement that allow us to use these tools to go back, see where things are working, see where we may be wasting student time, and see where we might be conflating different kinds of skills and put them together in new kinds of practice opportunities. As I mentioned, another distinguisher is that we're consistently engaged in research. I think that the OLI statistics courseware is probably the most studied piece of courseware on the planet at this point. And I think that the research that we're best known for has been some of our accelerated learning results. We're looking at OLI students who are using the statistics materials in comparison to their peers who are taking a more traditional approach. What we found were that the students using these materials were able to complete the course in less time, both in terms of less study time, but also fewer in-person meetings. They showed higher learning gains using the National Chaos Test as our mechanism for evaluating those learning gains. And when we came back one semester later, it wasn't simply that the students using OLI crammed the materials and then lost them. What we were seeing was the same kind of retention of knowledge one semester later. That original study happened at Carnegie Mellon itself. There's a lot of interest in this, and so one of the questions was, this is fine, is this simply a tool that can help students at privileged institutions like CMU, or does it have broader applicability? Similar trials of this statistics course in large public systems came back to also show similar opportunities for cost saving, similar opportunities for productivity gains over time. And so the takeaway from this is not that OLI courseware will consistently produce better learning in half the time. The statistics course is exceptionally well designed, and I think that statistics as a domain lends itself very well to a courseware-based approach for study. But what we do believe is that this kind of science-informed iterative approach, particularly when deployed in a broader community with open access, can support gains in both learning and in productivity over an extended period of time. So over this period of time, we've seen the OLI course catalog grow. I've got just a few examples on the screen, and we've tried to emphasize not just a prioritization of STEM courses, but really building out courseware across a domain, across a broad set of domains, and not simply emphasizing full courses, but also recognizing that there are places where more modular approaches, teaching collaboration, can be built out and dropped into other courses. That's where OLI has been. Wanted to take a few minutes to talk about where we're headed. Probably one of the most important pieces of this has been our next generation platform. Platform is called Taurus. I've got a typo on the screen. I apologize. You never notice them until you're presenting. The platform is intended to be our next generation OLI delivery environment and a next generation learning engineering tool. And though I talk about it as the future, in fact, Taurus is currently live. We've got a version running at proton.oli.cmu.edu if you want to take a look. We have committed to keeping this an open source project, and so the code for this is freely available, GitHub repository at the bottom. Our goal in releasing this code openly was to really try to establish a broader community of practice and contribution into the software. That's been remarkably successful for a very young product. We have had some incredibly deep and rapid collaborations with colleagues at Arizona State University in the ETX Center, which has resulted in replication and porting of materials and capabilities from the Smart Sparrow tutoring platform into Taurus. That's live. It's how ETX is delivering their work. What we've learned from those past 20 years is that we cannot separate authoring and improvement and research and delivery. So the platform emphasizes a single platform to engage in those work, better support for faculty to take advantage of the open license and go in and customize the materials on a case-by-case basis, closer integration with the LMS, and a real emphasis on a tech stack that, while powerful, should keep costs for running the platform to a minimum. So how can we work together? What are the opportunities for engaging with OLI? Obviously, the use of the existing courseware. We have partnerships that range from work with individual faculty members to larger departmental, institutional, or even system-wide adoptions. We'd love to talk more about what kind of opportunities there are there. We have a number of different professional development programs and efforts. These range from more learning science-based efforts to programs that can help individual faculty members engage with data-driven iterative improvement, to very specific support for instructional designers and developers in building courseware with OLI. We're always looking for partners in new development efforts, and we're always looking for participants in our learning research. Finally, When we think about OLIs as a platform, we talk an awful lot about core native activities, the standard things that you should expect, multiple choice and graphs and sort of traditional machine gradable assessments. But we're also looking for new kinds of technological affordances that are either driving new pedagogical innovations or are better tied to domains of study. Going to teach chemistry, we really need a chemistry lab is just one example. So we're always looking for folks that want to partner around these new kinds of innovations and ideas. And with that, I'm going to leave you with the Herb Simon quote that I started with. Hopefully you'll think about this as an invitation to join with and engage in this community and improve education with us. And that was a very fast espresso fueled trip through OLI and its history. Questions, comments?
So I thought it was interesting. Can you share like what sort of professional development, you mentioned professional development, what sort of opportunities do you typically direct people to that are interested in some of the learning engineering, some of the learning sort of things you guys are learning through the platform?
Sure. So one of the easiest to dive into is a project that we call Simon Learn Lab Summer School. So if you Google Learn Lab Summer School, this should pop up. This is a 1-week program that is held at CMU as well. This will be our first time face-to-face in 2 years, but it's happening in July. The idea behind summer school is that participants show up with a project, and this may be grad students who have a research effort. These may be instructional designers or faculty that want to build a course. They're going to opt into one of 4 tracks, where one of the tracks is educational data mining, one is building cognitive tutors, we have a track on computer supported collaborative learning, and then a track in building courseware with OLI. And so as a participant, you'll spend the week sometimes getting overviews of different aspects of the individual tracks, right? So you'll learn a little bit about everything from some of the world's leading computer scientists, but you would spend most of your time, in this example, in the OLI tracks and emerge from it with an actual thing that you can take home and continue to work on. So in OLI, it's a few modules that you can then expand and teach with, though we've seen a lot of research proposals and projects emerge from the other efforts. So that's one example. We also run dedicated workshops on building courseware with OLI, partner with institutions or with systems to run those in ways that are going to be most convenient to participants. We have some projects on teaching with OLI that are a little more focused and narrow. So those are some quick examples.